So what we're going to do today is we're going to show hand wet sanding to remove orange peel, surface texture, and then this car actually has fish eyes and DIP, which stands for dirt in paint. And a lot of times, you know, if you got a shoddy paint booth or a contaminated shop, after the car is painted, if there's any kind of dirt or dust floating around there and it lands on the car, of course it sticks, and you see a little tiny clump in the paint, and that's called DIP. This car is actually here for our upcoming class in May. So I have 4 cars here for sanding. I got a 1941 Graham Hollywood street rod. I got a 1987 Chevy Silverado square body. I have a 1931 Model A that is in the paint booth today, and we have this Corvette, and this Corvette has a custom paint job, but it is horrible. And I bring that up because one of the first things I want to talk about is you should not be sanding factory paint. Yes, I know it can be done. Yes, I've done it myself. But the thing you got to remember about sanding factory paint is in most cases, the factory paint on a modern car is thinner than a Post-it note. So it's thinner than 3 mils, oftentimes thinner than 2 mils. So even if you're so talented that you're able to sand down the factory paint and buff it out without ever burning through, you have just left that clear coat just whisper thin, and now it may suffer premature clear coat failure. So it's just not a good idea. It can be done, sure it can be done, but probably not a good idea. But this makes for a great training car because A, it's black, you know, so the students are going to be able to see their sanding marks if they got them out or if they missed them, and of course they're going to be able to see if they truly got a swirl-free and a hologram-free finish by the time we're done sanding it, cutting it, buffing it, and then ceramic coating it. So great demonstration car. And also for that reason, I'm just going to work a section out in here because I want to save the mass of the car for the class, you know. Anyway, so that's what's going on with this car. 1981 Corvette 4-speed car, really nice muscle car, but kind of a shoddy paint job. But that's okay. Gives us something to perfect. Now, this is something a lot of people have been interested in. This is, Harbor Freight has actually introduced sanding sheets or sanding papers and sanding discs. So this week, we're going to go over the Harbor Freight sanding sheets. These come in 9x11. I think they start at like 180 grit and go up to like 3,000 or 4,000 grit.
180?
There's a wide variety of grits, you know, for doing prep work, but also for the finishing side. And they actually, I was kind of looking at this, they actually have a really nice graph back here that kind of shows what the different grits are. And you finally get over here to the 1500 and 2000, and it says finishing and defect removal. So they have their own sanding papers, and on the box it says it's good for wet or dry. And usually most wet papers can be used for dry, but the thing about it is some papers, some discs offer anti-clogging characteristics to help them from getting loaded up with paint as you're sanding dry. With wet, as I'm going to show you, you know, you've got a lubricant in there that helps the paper from getting clogged up. Now, they also have their own sanding block. And I just wanted to share this and talk about this. This is a copy of the 3M. The 3M is a rubber block. And normally the way you do this is you take your full sheet of sandpaper, 9x11, and then you're going to cut out, you can actually get 4 strips out of it. So I cut 3 here. I still got 1 that's already on the paper. And I never liked the 3M blocks because the bottom is never flat. So if the whole idea is to flatten out the paint, you need something that you're sanding with that's absolutely flat. And the 3M, they were never flat. They're warbled. They're got little imperfections in them. This one is actually pretty flat. But when I went to use this, I'm just going to show you. Normally what you do with one of these blocks is you pull up on one of the ends, and there's these little 3 steel teeth in there. Then you pull your paper around, attach it, push it down. It clamps that paper into place. You pull to the back side, stick it in there, clamp it down, and now it's secured in place and you're ready to start sanding. So what I did is what I did normally with the 3M is I pulled this thing back and it broke. So I would describe this material as rubber-like. So rubber-like. It's like rubber, but it's not rubber. So if Harbor Freight's watching this, you know, you got a good first start. It's not a bad block, but you need to make this actually more flexible, because the hardest thing about putting these discs on is pulling this thing back all with 2 hands and getting this thing put together. So that's one option. But it's nice that they have a complete system. So you can go to Harbor Freight, get your sanding papers, get a sanding block, and you're ready to start sanding. Now, I went and borrowed this. Usually I recommend and use the Meguiar's The part number is E-7200. It's a flexible, rigid, flexible backing pad, and is by far my favorite. But all of mine, I got a dozen of these for my classes. All of mine are in a box coming from Chicago back here because we use them on the AC Cobra. So I borrowed this from my good friend Robert DiTrolisi, and this is actually a Dura-Block, and they make all kinds of different blocks, different shapes, different sizes for sanding application. But anyway, this one here is just your basic. It's actually fairly rigid, which is good because the harder the block is, the smoother the surface. When you're sanding, it keeps all the sanding action on the very high points, which is what you're trying to remove, the high points, and then you sand until you get it completely flattened out or leveled, and then you stop and move on to a new area. So you want a rigid block that's about this size. And then the way you use this is you take your 9.5 by 11 paper, and what you're going to do is you're going to fold this thing in half. Let's just do this live here. And then either, crease it a couple times and tear it, or I've actually got a pair of scissors that I prefer to use. And one thing, a little tip I want to share here, I don't know if you can zoom in on this, but I got a bunch of these scissors around here, but this one actually says sandpaper. Okay, and the reason I do this is because when you cut sanding discs, because I oftentimes make my own 3-inch, 2-inch, and 1-inch sanding disc, or you cut sanding paper, you're cutting something with abrasives and it dulls your scissors down. So I write sanding paper on this one and I reserve it only for sandpaper, and it keeps my other scissors for cutting paper sharp. So that's how that works. Let me fold this again. And then what you want to do, and I've already done this, is I've got a bucket of water here, and you want to take and put a few drops of dishwashing soap, or in this case I use the Dr. Beasley ceramic body washes, a little bit of lubricant, and then I got a spray bottle, same thing. You can see the bubbles are in there. This is a little bit of soap in there. And you want to take and put a little soap in there, and here's the reason why. The soap does two things. It lubricates the surface to make the sanding action smoother, and then it also helps to keep the sanding paper, or if you're machine sanding, the sanding disc from loading up with the removed material, the paint you're taking off. And sanding, because this sandpaper is very grippy, this is 2000 grit, it's going to want to grip the paint, so having a little bit of lubrication there helps you with inertia to keep your hand movement going to sand the paint in a smooth pattern so you have an even sanding mark pattern. Now, once you've got your 9x11 cut, then the next thing you want to do is there's two ways. There's two ways to put this on the block. And everybody has their own preference. I was just with my good friend Rod Kraft. Rod likes to fold. I'm a wrapper. But if you want to fold, that would look like this. You would take your sanding paper, your half sleeve or half sheet, and you would fold it in half. Then you'd basically just take and wrap this around your block like that. And then everybody's got to kind of figure out how to hold it. I take my thumb and my finger, put it on the side of the block. That gives me 3 fingers to kind of push down on the face of the block. So when I'm sanding, I can distribute the pressure of my hand equally. Okay, and then that's folding. Then I like to wrap. So wrapping is when you just actually take the paper and you wrap it around. And basically when you're using a sanding block up this like this, so that's wrap. But basically you're going to get to use basically 2 sides of a half sheet, you can cut them up and use them for smaller sanding blocks and things like that, but that's how you use it. Then normally you want to take and soak these for about 30 minutes in some water before you use them. Now, I didn't soak these. This is going to be a fairly quick demonstration, but you do want to soak them. You want to be careful you don't soak them too long because some of the cheaper papers will actually fall apart in the water. Okay, so there we go, soaked. Now I got my soapy water, and we're going to come over here. And Yancey, if you want to maybe come in and see if you can show me where you can pick up the lettering behind me to show before and after.
Okay, let me grab this.
And I have already taken and clayed this. Years ago I wrote this article. It's got a really long title, but it goes like this. The most common place to get overspray paint is a body shop. And the reason why is because say your Corvette goes in, it's in the paint booth, it's getting a paint job, it comes out, and you're thinking, well, there's no chance to get overspray now. It's out of the paint booth. But that's not true. You got, people in the body shop, workshop there, spraying things called guide coats, or maybe putting some primer on a part before it goes into the paint booth. And all that stuff floats around and lands on your freshly painted car, on the glass, on the wheels, on the paint, everything. So the most common place to get overspray paint is at a body shop. Even though you think it'd be a kind of a safe place, it's not like that. Okay, so I'm going to put down some soapy water right here. I'm going to get rid of this, and then I'm going to cover a couple of basic techniques now. Whenever you're sanding with a block like this, you don't actually want to sand perpendicular because you'll put ruts in where the edges are. So you want to turn it, or the word is cant. You want to cant it or tilt it a little bit and then sand like that. And when you're starting out, you can go slow, but I'm going to tell you, there's something to be said for inertia. Getting your hand moving helps you to keep it moving, because again, this paper is going to want to grab and stop on you, so you want to get your hand moving. And as far as the work size, I always teach people, especially when you're starting out, you want to tackle small sections at a time, about the size of a microfiber towel, something that you can manage with equal pressure over your hand. You know, when I'm standing right here, it's easy for me to push down. The further my arm leaves my body, I got to focus more on keeping the same pressure throughout my entire arm. And it's a little more difficult, a little more tiring. Okay, so here we go. And then as you're moving this sandpaper over the surface, you want to do what's called make a tight pattern. And what that means is you want to move the sandpaper over just a little bit, like 1/8 or 3/8 of an inch at a time. So you're going like this, real tight as you move across the panel. You don't want to make M's or W's, you know, this huge pattern. It's going to leave a horrible looking sanding mark pattern, and you're not really leveling the paint in the best way possible. So then if you look down here, you can actually see where the water is turning white. So this is called your slurry. And this, whenever you abrade something clear, it turns opaque. So that's why you see this is white. Now, in the old days, they called this color sanding, but that's before base coat, clear coat technology was introduced. So when you'd sand on the paint, you were actually sanding on pigmented paint, so the slurry would be the color of the paint. Blue paint, you'd have a blue slurry, so they called that color sanding. But it's the same kind of thing. We're sanding with some paper to level and flatten down the orange peel. And then another thing I like to do is there's a raised body line right here, and I can feel that with my thumb. So I know as I get closer, I want to kind of stay away. In my classes, I teach what I call the rule of thumb. Some guys like it, some guys don't. But what that means is wherever you've got a raised body line, like the top of this fender or an edge where the hood meets the fender, I stay about a thumbnail distance away. And the reason why is because you don't want to sand right on the edges, because it's going to be really hard to bring a spinning wheel pad down and buff the sanding marks out and not burn through the edge. Now, there is a way to skin that cat, and that's by using a tool like the Rupes Nano with a 1-inch pad, or the Flex Pixie with a 1-inch pad, both of these in rotary mode. And basically you're just taking a very small rotary and you're going along all the edges that you sanded and pulling out your sand marks very safely instead of a big 8-inch pad spinning on a big rotary. The problem with that is, and most of you experienced guys will understand this, the problem with it is think how long that would take you to take a little 1-inch pad around every raised body line and edge on this car. So what I teach is big picture. Guys like Jason Kilmer, they get the big bucks for doing show car sanding. They can spend a month on a car. But in the real world, you know, if you're talented enough that someone's going to bring you a car like this and say, hey, would you sand it down? The normal price range for something like this is around $3,000. That's enough money to cover for your sanding tools and make a pretty good profit. But you're not going to make any money if you spend 2 weeks on the car pulling sanding marks out by the edge. So what I do is I lower my customers' expectations by telling them about the rule of thumb, explain I don't want to burn through all their edges. They appreciate that, and the car's still going to look great. So it's called the rule of thumb. You could type that into Google and probably pull up my article on that. And of course that does mean that if you stand back and look real closely, you'll see no orange peel, and then you start to get to the edges, a little bit of orange peel kicks back in. But it doesn't really distract from the beauty of the car, and is back to making a profit, not working on some other dude's street rod for free. Okay, did you want to come and get a picture of this where I flattened it all out?
I got it right here.
Oh, okay. So I flattened this out, and you can kind of see where there's DIP. Okay, so there's a little piece of dirt right here that I didn't completely sand flat on purpose. Then there's a little crater, so that's a fisheye. And then you can also see the hills and valleys where I didn't sand it enough, again, on purpose, just because I want to do a small spot here. So that's basically how you do it. Now, one of the things, I love Jason Rose, he's got this saying that goes like this: top coat hardness is an unknown factor. God, I love that statement. And he's absolutely correct. I don't know if this paint is hard or soft. Well, I do, because I already did a test spot. But a lot of times when you're buffing out a car, you don't know if it's hard or soft until you go to buff it. And also to sand it. And the harder the paint is, the harder it's going to abrade. And I thought this paint's kind of in that medium range, right where you wanted it. It sanded easy, it buffed easy. Okay. Anyway, so the next thing you want to do is you would actually sand down this entire car. If it were me, of course, I would start on the roof, work my way down. When it comes to large panels, I start in the middle and work my way out. I don't start here and work my way in. You just need to have a method for the madness. So every time you go out in the garage, you're going, how should I do it this time? It shouldn't be different. You should have a method to your madness. But on these large panels, you want to start in the center, work your way out. And I would sand this whole thing down with my first grit, and then I'd either follow that with a second or a follow-up step with a less aggressive sandpaper. The purpose of this would be to refine the sanding marks to make the buffing easier. It's always better to spend more time sanding so you spend less time buffing. Plus the buffing generates heat. Sanding's very cool. But in this case, 2000 as far as I'm going to go with this. The class is actually going to learn dry sanding on this car. And when they do the dry sanding, we're going to start out with 1500 by Eagle abrasives, and then we're going to go to 2500 all hand sanding dry, and then we'll start buffing it out. So it's kind of a similar process here. Okay, so the next thing I would do is I want to take and pull out my sanding marks. Just got done teaching a class in Chicago, and of course one of the topics was sanding and buffing, and then how do you use a wool pad on a rotary. And I get asked this all the time, well, Mike, can't you use an orbital? Sure, if an orbital will take scratches out of paint, it'll take sanding marks out. The difference is the speed and the effectiveness. It's going to be faster to use a fiber, a wool pad on a rotary, not so much for the big flat areas, but everywhere you got to get up on edge to get into tight areas, thin panels around raised body lines and edges. Free spinning tools are just going to tend to stall out when you're trying to do that work, so it's going to add more time to the process overall. And you should never sand clear coat with a gear-driven tool, like the Rupes Millet, the Flex Beast, the Harbor Freight forced rotation orbital polisher. They work great for boats where the gel coat's thicker, but on car paint, actually what it does is it takes too much paint off too fast. It does scalloping. I got an article on that somewhere too, scalloping. So you don't want to use a gear-driven orbital for sanding, but any free spinning sanding polisher will work. And by the way, next week, this car is going to be here all the way to May. Next week, I'm going to show how to use the Harbor Freight Bauer. They call this a 6-inch DA, but that's because it has a 6-inch backing plate, which doesn't even make any sense. It's an 8mm free spinning random orbital polisher because the stroke is 8mm. So that's what they should call it, an 8mm. But for some reason, everybody out there in the world always names their tool after the backing plate size. But I'm going to show how to use that with the Harbor Freight sanding discs. And they just introduced foam backed and sanding films and their own interface pad. So next week we'll probably flip the car and I'll show you how to use the machine sanding system on the other side of the hood here. Okay, so pulling sanding marks out. So I put a strip of product down there, and I always teach guys, you want to get a good foot stance, brace yourself, and in the beginning you're usually going to, for the parts that are way out in the middle, you're going to be leaning on the car. So that's why you never want to buff the sides out first, because then you lean on them, you could scratch them back up. So knock out all the horizontal surfaces first. Okay, so what you want to do is called pick up your bead using the 10 at 10 technique. Once you pick it up, lay the pad down flat, spread your product out. I always try to make this look like it's really hard. Okay, now I got to spread out. I'm going to push down. People always say, how hard are you pushing? And I go, oh, right now I'd say I'm about 15 pounds. You can hear the motor bog down. But what I want to do right now is I want to cut the paint. I want to cut it with these fibers in the abrasive technology. I'm using the Dr. Beasley's NSP 150. That's the Dr. Beasley's version of what you guys all call a compound. The difference is that it's very unique abrasive technology in that all the abrasives are perfectly sphere in shape and perfectly size. They're all the same size. And so everywhere that abrasive particle is on the surface, it's always cutting evenly. So that's kind of something different about our products than everybody else's. No black paint. So far, that's a good sign. By the way, if you're buffing on a base coat, clear coat paint job, and you turn your polish over to see the color of the base coat, it's a really bad sign. So I make sure I got them all out before Yancy comes in here. A lot of times when I shoot the videos, I got my contacts in, so I can't see as well. But it's okay. It's not my car. Okay, so there we go. You can see using a wool pad, kind of dusty there. That one's been used a lot and it's been washed, but sometimes when you go to clean it, some of the previous dust that didn't get washed out comes flying out of there. Okay, so then inspect, and as far as I can tell, I have all my, oh, there's some right there. I'm gonna get those out. And this is where it's nice to have good lighting in your shop, good overhead lights, good handheld lights. I want to pull these out because if I don't, I know Yancey will focus on them. And usually what I do is you see me moving this thing back and forth, so I move it, I cut, and I'm coming back and looking to see if the marks are gone. As soon as they're gone, I move on to new territory. Don't keep polishing the same place needlessly. Okay. So then after cutting with the wool pad, and always remember, anytime you're cutting with wool, you got two things working for you. You got the fibers. Each one of these zillions of fibers are cutting, and you have the abrasive technology. You have two things cutting. And that's why a fiber pad is more aggressive than a foam pad, because a foam pad has a uniform surface texture. It doesn't have all those individual fibers, so it is never going to be as aggressive. But that's why you use a foam pad to come back and pull out your holograms. Okay, so this is the Beast. Let's switch over to 95 here. With this stuff, you really only need, pea-size or dime-size drops. But when I'm starting with a fresh dry pad, I like to put 4 drops on there. And the reason I like to reduce my pressure to make a few more passes is just because, as I always like to tell people, polishing paint is an art form. It's not a grinding process. We bring the human elements of care and passion to the process, and that's where the beauty comes from. Wow, that came out amazing. And of course, then after that, if this was true show car detailing, I would actually probably do a third polishing step with the super soft foam finishing pad, like this Lake Country black foam. Every foam company has their own color code. And I would drop down to NSP 45 and then put the ceramic coating on this car. And that's probably what the class will do. It just depends on the paint hardness. What I just saw here is this foam polishing pad finished out just beautiful. So you wouldn't have to go any further. It just depends what you're trying to do. Some customers want everything you can give them. Some people, their budget says no, two buffing processes is more than enough. Anyway, that's how you take and remove orange peel by wet sanding by hand using the Harbor Freight system. And this is the first time I've ever used this, so, people always say, how long does the paper last, for sanding? How many panels can you get out of a sheet? So I haven't used it enough to be able to give you that answer, but moving forward, as I sand down more cars, I will definitely be trying this paper out, and I can give you some feedback at that point. And it will be interesting next week to go over their new machine sanding system with a foam back disc, kind of like the 3M Trizac on the foam, because it's kind of thin, but it has the mesh interface or top here, kind of like Mirka Abralon. Now, their sanding disc, this is 1500, and I tell you, that feels like a piece of fine paper. I don't feel nothing there at all. So this will be interesting to test out on the other side of the hood next week. That's all I got, Yancey.
That's all you got?
It's a cool car, and I'm sure you picked this up, but that finish is freaking amazing. We could go a little bit further and flatten it out even more. The flatter you get the paint, the more you increase what's called DOI. So DOI stands for distinction of image. So always think of it like this: a mirror is 100% DOI, and before we started buffing on or sanding on this paint has orange peel, so it has a very low DO. It might be like the 40, it might be very low because it doesn't have a perfect reflection when you look into it. So the goal of sanding and to create a show car finish is you're sanding that paint flat, then restoring the gloss and clarity, so when you look at it, it has a mirror finish.